It's May 16, 2013. Portola Valley, California. Ian Gibbons sat at his kitchen table with a glass of wine and a bottle of acetaminophen. He was 67 years old, a Cambridge-trained biochemist with nearly 200 patents to his name and 30 years of diagnostic research behind him. Tomorrow morning, lawyers would put him under oath and ask what he knew about the blood testing technology at Theranos, the $9 billion company where he served as chief scientist. He knew the machine did not work. He knew the results were unreliable. He knew patients were receiving diagnoses based on fiction. He also knew that if he said any of this out loud, the company would destroy him. He did not make it to the deposition. This is the story of Theranos, and it starts 20 years earlier with a teenager who was afraid of needles. Elizabeth Holmes was born on February 3, 1984, in Washington, D.C. Her father, Christian Holmes IV, was a vice president at Enron. Her mother, Noelle, was a congressional committee staffer. The family had old money on both sides. Her great-great-great-grandfather was Charles Louis Fleischmann, the man who built the Fleischmann's yeast empire. She grew up in a world where power and influence were not abstract concepts. They were people who came to dinner. Holmes was ambitious from childhood. By her own account, she wanted to be a billionaire by the age of 10. Not a doctor, not a scientist, a billionaire. In 2002, at 18, she enrolled at Stanford to study chemical engineering. During the summer after her freshman year, she worked at the Genome Institute of Singapore, collecting blood samples to test for SARS using traditional syringes. She later said the experience crystallized her thinking. What if you could run dozens of tests from a tiny amount of blood, drawn from a finger prick instead of a needle? What if you could do it faster, cheaper, and in a pharmacy instead of a hospital? She brought the idea to Phyllis Gardner, a professor of medicine at Stanford. Gardner told her it would not work. The physics of small blood volumes made accurate testing extraordinarily difficult. Dilution effects, temperature sensitivity, clotting factors, and the sheer number of analytes that needed to be measured from a tiny sample all worked against the concept. There was a reason the diagnostic industry used venous blood draws. It was not because nobody had thought of something simpler, it was because the simpler thing did not produce reliable results. Holmes did not accept this. She did what she would do many times over the next 2 decades when confronted with someone who said no. She found someone who would say yes. Channing Robertson, a professor of chemical engineering with a background in medical devices, became her academic champion and eventually a member of her board. Robertson would later recruit Ian Gibbons to Theranos, connecting the person who believed in the vision with the person who would discover it was hollow. In March 2004, Holmes dropped out of Stanford. She used her tuition money as seed funding and founded a company she initially called Real-Time Cures. The name was later changed to Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. She was 19 years old. She had no degree, no medical training, no laboratory experience beyond a summer internship, and no evidence that her idea was scientifically feasible. What she had was conviction, a story about saving lives, and access to people who could write large checks. In Silicon Valley in 2004, that combination was worth more than a working prototype. By December 2004, Holmes had raised $6 million at a valuation of $30 million. The early investors included Tim Draper of Draper Fisher Gervais Son, a venture capitalist who happened to be a neighbor of the Holmes family. Draper would later say he was drawn to Holmes's intensity and conviction. He compared her to Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. He did not ask for independently verified test results. Within 6 years, fundraising totals exceeded $92 million. The pitch was simple and powerful, a world where comprehensive blood testing requires no needles, no hospital visits, and costs a fraction of what traditional labs charge. It was, in every way, a perfect Silicon Valley story. And like many perfect Silicon Valley stories, it had one critical flaw. The product did not exist. It's the core of Theranos' promise was a device called the Edison. It was supposed to be a compact analyzer that could perform a wide range of blood tests from blood collected in a proprietary container called a nanotainer. The nanotainer was 12.9 millimeters tall and held about 2 drops of blood. A patient would walk into a Walgreens, get a finger prick, fill a nanotainer, and within hours receive results for dozens of tests that would normally require multiple tubes drawn from a vein. The first person who understood this would not work was Ian Gibbons. Recruited in 2005 by Channing Robertson, Gibbons joined Theranos as chief scientist, the first person with real diagnostic expertise in the building. He had spent decades at Siva Company and BioTrack Laboratories developing blood assay technologies and held 19 patents for techniques he had created. He knew what reliable blood testing looked like. The Edison was not it. Almost immediately, Gibbons found that the Edison's results did not match the benchmarks set by commercial analyzers. Some tests were wildly off. He insisted that developmental results needed to match established commercial benchmarks before anything could be deployed. This was standard practice in the diagnostic industry. At Theranos, it was treated as obstruction. Gibbons told Holmes directly in 2006 that the technology was not fit for use by the general public. Holmes did not want to hear it. The company operated under extreme secrecy, departments siloed from one another. Holmes claimed this was to protect trade secrets. In practice, it prevented engineers in one group from knowing what engineers in another group were doing, which made effective problem-solving impossible. And then there was Ramesh Balwani. Holmes had met Balwani in 2002 when she was 18 and he was 37. They began a romantic relationship that they concealed from the board, investors, and most employees. Balwani joined Theranos in 2009 as president and chief operating officer, despite having no background in medical devices or diagnostics. Together, they ran the company with what employees described as a regime of secrecy and fear. Staff signed non-disclosure agreements so aggressive that many were afraid to speak to family members about their work. Employees who raised concerns were marginalized or fired. Gibbons was demoted. Others simply left. The turnover was constant. Scientists and engineers joined Theranos believing they would work on revolutionary technology. They discovered a company where questioning the data was treated as disloyalty, where departments were forbidden from sharing information with each other, and where the gap between what was promised to investors and what actually happened in the laboratory grew wider every month. Through all of it, the Edison never produced reliable results. When Theranos could not make its own machine work, it started running the vast majority of its tests on commercially available machines made by Siemens. The finger prick samples were often diluted to create enough volume for these traditional machines, introducing additional inaccuracies. The company that claimed to have reinvented blood testing was, in practice, doing blood testing badly on other people's equipment, and nobody outside the building knew. The secrecy that Holmes maintained was not protecting trade secrets. It was protecting the fact that there were no secrets to protect. The Edison did not work. The nanotainer did not work. The revolution was a fiction maintained by non-disclosure agreements, staged demonstrations, and the unwillingness of powerful people to admit they had been fooled. If the technology was broken, the boardroom was immaculate. In July 2011, Holmes was introduced to George Shultz, who had served as Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. After a 2-hour meeting, Shultz joined the Theranos board. Over the next 3 years, Holmes assembled what journalists would later call the most illustrious board in American corporate history. George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State under Nixon, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Sam Nunn, former chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, James Mattis, the Marine Corps general who would later serve as Secretary of Defense under Trump, Richard Kovacevich, former CEO of Wells Fargo, Riley Bechtel, former CEO of the Bechtel Group, Gary Roughead, a retired admiral and former chief of naval operations. Not a single one of them had a background in medicine, biology, or diagnostic science. This was not an oversight. It was a strategy. Holmes understood that a board of political and military heavyweights provided something more valuable than scientific scrutiny. It provided credibility. When the former Secretary of State vouches for your company, investors do not ask to see the data. When a 4-star general sits on your board, regulators give you the benefit of the doubt. The board was a shield. Its prestige discouraged the one thing that would have ended Theranos immediately: due diligence. The investors followed the board's lead. Between 2004 and 2015, Theranos raised more than $700 million. The Walton family put in $150 million. The DeVos family invested $100 million. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. None of them demanded an independent audit. None of them insisted on peer-reviewed evidence. The valuation reached $9 billion, and 0 peer-reviewed studies. Not a single one. In February 2015, John Ioannidis, a professor at Stanford and one of the most cited scientists in the world, pointed this out in the Journal of the American Medical Association. A company valued at $9 billion, claiming to have revolutionized an entire field of medicine, had never submitted its work to the scrutiny of independent scientists. 3 months later, Eleftherios Diamandis, a professor of clinical biochemistry at the University of Toronto, analyzed the available information and concluded that most of the company's claims were exaggerated. Nobody listened, not yet. The signals were there for anyone willing to look. A company that operated in stealth for a decade. A technology never demonstrated to independent scientists. A board with no medical expertise. A founder with no degree and no scientific publications. Every red flag that should have triggered scrutiny was neutralized by the prestige of the people who had already endorsed it. The board protected the valuation. The valuation attracted more investors. The investors validated the board. It was a closed loop of credibility with nothing at its center. In September 2013, Theranos had emerged from stealth mode and announced a partnership with Walgreens to launch in-store blood testing at more than 40 locations. The promise was irresistible. Walk in, get a finger prick, receive results at a fraction of the traditional cost. Walgreens saw it as a weapon against CVS and invested heavily. When Kevin Hunter, a Walgreens laboratory consultant, raised concerns and recommended bringing in outside experts to evaluate the Edison, leadership overruled him. They were afraid of losing the deal to CVS. Safeway went further. The grocery chain invested $350 million to retrofit 800 stores with clinics designed for Theranos testing. $350 million, 800 stores. Safeway built prototype clinics, hired staff, redesigned store layouts. Year after year, Theranos missed its deadlines. The trial clinic at Safeway's own corporate headquarters produced results that raised questions nobody at Theranos wanted to answer. After years of waiting, the deal collapsed in 2015. Not a single store was converted. $350 million, spent on a partnership with a company whose technology did not function. Safeway CEO, Steve Bird, had championed the deal personally. He retired in 2013 before the full extent of the failure became clear. His successor inherited the wreckage. Theranos also claimed its technology was being used in drug trials by Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline. When journalists checked, both companies denied any formal partnership. Theranos had performed some tests for them, but not using the Edison. Using commercial machines. The media, meanwhile, saw only the story it wanted to see. Holmes appeared on the covers of Fortune, Forbes, Inc., and the New York Times Style magazine in 2014 alone. The New Yorker ran a 12,000-word profile by Ken Auletta. Vice President Joe Biden toured the Theranos lab. Holmes spoke at TED, at the Clinton Global Initiative, at Fortune's Most Powerful Women Summit. She was named to the Time 100 list of the most influential people in the world. Not a single journalist who wrote those profiles asked to see independently verified data. The narrative was too good. A young woman in a man's world. A college dropout in the footsteps of Steve Jobs. A mission to save lives. Nobody wanted to be the person who killed the story by asking an inconvenient question. Holmes had studied Steve Jobs obsessively. She wore the same black turtleneck every day. She adopted a deep baritone voice so artificial that former Stanford classmates said they had never heard her speak that way. She controlled every aspect of her public image, with a discipline that extended to the company itself. Visitors to Theranos headquarters were given carefully staged demonstrations. Investors were shown results that appeared impressive but were never independently verified. The demonstrations worked because the audience wanted them to work. When you are sitting across from Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, both of whom have endorsed the company, skepticism feels like rudeness. Meanwhile, in the Theranos labs, technicians were running patient samples on Siemens machines and filing the results under the Theranos name. That's while the media celebrated Holmes, Ian Gibbons was being crushed by what he knew. In 2011, Theranos became entangled in a patent lawsuit with Richard Fuish, a former neighbor of the Holmes family. Fuish noticed that Gibbons was named as co-inventor on many of Theranos' patents. He subpoenaed Gibbons to testify. Gibbons was trapped. If he told the truth under oath, he would expose Theranos and be fired. He had been diagnosed with colon cancer in 2007 and undergone chemotherapy and multiple surgeries. He was 67 and felt he had no prospects outside the company. If he lied, he would be committing perjury. If he said nothing, he would carry the weight of knowing that patients were being harmed by technology he had tried for 8 years to fix. His wife, Rochelle, later described his state of mind. It was hell for him to work there. Complete hell. I think that he was very confused about why he was being treated so badly. Theranos' lawyers actively discouraged him from testifying. They sent him a draft doctor's note that could be adapted to excuse him from the deposition. On the evening of May 16, 2013, Ian Gibbons ingested a combination of wine and acetaminophen. He was hospitalized for several days and died of liver failure on May 23rd. When Rochelle called Theranos to inform them, the company's first response was not to offer condolences. It was to send someone to recover any company property in Ian's possession. Their lawyers then contacted Rochelle to prevent any of his personal papers from being shared. 2 years after Gibbons died, John Carreyrou, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, received a tip from a pathologist who found Theranos' claims suspicious. Carreyrou began a months-long investigation, and his most important sources were people who had seen the failures from inside. Tyler Shultz had worked at Theranos from 2013 to 2014. He was also the grandson of board member George Shultz. Tyler had tried to raise concerns internally first. He emailed Holmes directly, documenting specific quality control problems. He was told he did not understand the technology. He then reported the company to the New York State Department of Health under an alias. When that produced nothing, he spoke to Carreyrou. When Theranos discovered the investigation, Holmes deployed David Boies, chairman of Boies Schiller Flexner, one of the most powerful law firms in America, and a member of the Theranos board who had taken equity as compensation. Boies sent legal threats to the Journal and to individual sources. His firm hired private investigators to follow and surveil former employees. The message was clear. If you talk, We will find you, and we will make your life very expensive. This was not an empty threat. Theranos had the resources and the legal firepower to bury anyone who challenged it. The same prestige that protected the company from scientific scrutiny now protected it from accountability. The elder George Shultz, learning his grandson was a source, invited Tyler to his house. Tyler arrived to find Theranos lawyers waiting in the living room. He was 24 years old. He spent more than $400,000 in legal fees defending himself, money his parents provided from their savings. Sarah Kachung, another former lab employee who had witnessed testing failures firsthand, faced similar pressure. Legal threats and surveillance followed her after she left the company. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's first article. It revealed that Theranos was running the majority of its tests on commercial machines, not the Edison, and that the Edison's results were unreliable. Holmes appeared on CNBC's Mad Money that same evening. When Jim Cramer said the article was brutal, she looked into the camera and said, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." She changed nothing. Carreyrou published follow-up articles throughout 2015 and 2016, each one peeling back another layer of deception. The dominoes fell in sequence, and they fell fast. In January 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected the Theranos lab in Newark, California, and found conditions that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. A warfarin dosage test was so inaccurate that patients could have received dangerously wrong doses. Warfarin is a drug where the difference between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one is measured in milligrams. Getting the number wrong does not cause discomfort. It causes strokes or fatal hemorrhaging. CMS banned Holmes from operating any clinical laboratory for 2 years. In May 2016, Theranos voided 2 years of results from the Edison. 2 years. Tens of thousands of patients were told their results might be wrong. People who had made decisions about medications, surgeries, and cancer screenings based on those results were left to wonder whether their diagnoses had been real. Within 2 weeks, Walgreens terminated the partnership. Arizona's Attorney General, Mark Brnovich, sued Theranos for selling 1.5 million blood tests to state residents while concealing that the results were unreliable. The settlement cost $4.65 million, but the real cost was borne by the patients who had made medical decisions based on numbers that came from a machine that did not work. Cancer screenings that showed nothing when something was there. Blood-thinning drug dosages calibrated to fictional values. Cholesterol levels that triggered unnecessary treatment or missed dangerous conditions. These were not hypothetical harms. They were real people making real decisions with bad information. The celebrity board dissolved. Holmes laid off 40% of the workforce, then another 41%. Fortress Investment Group loaned $100 million, secured by patents, to keep the company alive. It was not enough. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Balwani on wire fraud charges. Theranos dissolved in September 2018. Forbes revised Holmes' net worth from $4.5 billion to zero. Fortune, which had featured her on its cover, named her one of the world's most disappointing leaders. The same publications that had built the myth now competed to tear it down, but the damage was already done. The money was spent, the patients had been tested, the results had been acted on, and Gibbons was dead. Her trial began in August 2021, delayed repeatedly by the pandemic and by Holmes having 2 children. Her defense was twofold. She claimed she genuinely believed the technology worked, and that any failures were the result of subordinates not executing her vision. She also testified that Balwani had been emotionally and sexually abusive throughout their decade-long relationship, and that his control over her explained her actions. Balwani denied the abuse allegations. His lawyers argued that Holmes was using him as a scapegoat. On January 3, 2022, the jury found Holmes guilty of 4 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, all related to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on 4 counts related to defrauding patients. The distinction mattered legally, but felt thin morally. The investors lost money. The patients received wrong test results for diseases including cancer and blood disorders. Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months. Balwani was tried separately, convicted on all 12 counts, and sentenced to nearly 13 years. Together, they were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution. On May 30, 2023, Holmes reported to federal prison Camp Bryan in Texas. In 2025, she gave an interview from prison. She said she still intended to revolutionize the medical testing industry. Phyllis Gardner, the Stanford professor who had told Holmes in 2003 that finger-prick blood testing would not work, watched the trial from California. In interviews after the verdict, Gardner reflected on their first meeting 20 years earlier. She had explained the science clearly. She had told Holmes the physics did not support the idea. Holmes had smiled, thanked her, and walked out of her office to find someone who would say yes. Gardner had spent 2 decades watching what happened next. Theranos was a stress test of every institution that was supposed to prevent exactly this from happening. The board did not question the science. The investors did not demand proof. The regulators moved slowly. The media amplified the narrative without scrutiny. The corporate partners invested hundreds of millions without independent verification. And the employees who tried to raise alarms were threatened, surveilled, and silenced. The numbers tell the story in a language that cannot be argued with. $9 billion in valuation, $700 million raised from investors, $350 million spent by Safeway on stores that never opened, 1.5 million blood tests sold in Arizona with results that could not be trusted, 40 Walgreens locations offering diagnoses from a machine that did not work, 0 peer-reviewed studies, 0 independent audits, and 1 chief scientist who had tried for 8 years to tell the truth, buried by the company he tried to save. Ian Gibbons did not live to see any of it, not the journal article, not the indictment, not the trial, not the conviction. He died on May 23, 2013, in a hospital in California, from liver failure caused by an overdose the night before he was supposed to tell someone, under oath, what he had been trying to tell Theranos for 8 years. That the machine did not work, that the results were wrong, that real patients were being harmed by technology that existed only as a promise. His wife, Rochelle, spent years afterward fighting to ensure that Ian's role in the story was not erased. She spoke to Carreyrou. She spoke to documentary filmmakers. She spoke to anyone who would listen about a man who had given his career and ultimately his life to a company that responded to his death by asking for its property back. Rochelle understood something that took the rest of the world a decade to accept, that Theranos was not a company that failed. It was a company that knew it was failing and chose to keep going. Ian had known this from 2006. He had told them. They had demoted him, silenced him, and when he was finally subpoenaed to tell someone else, they sent him a draft excuse note. The company did not want the truth. It never had. Holmes is scheduled for release in 2032. Ian Gibbons has no Wikipedia page longer than a few paragraphs. His 30 years of legitimate scientific work, his nearly 200 patents, his groundbreaking research on immunoassays, all of it is a footnote in someone else's scandal. On the evening of May 16, 2013, a 67-year-old scientist sat at his kitchen table in Portola Valley. He had spent 8 years trying to tell the truth. Nobody had listened. He did not make it to the morning. That is what Theranos cost.